On April 30th, 1945, Eva Braun swallowed cyanide beside Adolf Hitler in the bunker beneath Berlin. She had been his companion for over a decade, hidden from the German public, kept off the stage of history until the very end. And you would assume that her family was destroyed along with her, imprisoned, executed, or hunted to the ends of the earth. But here is the part nobody expects. Every single member of Eva Braun's immediate family survived the war. Her mother, her father, both of her sisters, all of them lived for decades afterward, and all of them died in Bavaria. Because the real punishment was not what the Allies did to them, it was what they did to themselves. The week that broke everything. To understand what happened to the Braun family after the war, you have to understand where they stood in the final days of it, because they were not on the periphery, they were deep inside the collapse. Eva had travelled to Berlin against her family's desperate pleas to stay away. Her younger sister Gretl, 8 months pregnant, was living on the Obersalzberg, the mountain retreat where Hitler's inner circle had spent years entertaining, scheming, and pretending the war could still be won. And Gretl's husband was SS Gruppenführer Hermann Fegelein, a high-ranking officer who had married into the family at a lavish ceremony attended by Hitler himself. But in the final days of April 1945, Fegelein made a fatal mistake. He tried to desert Berlin. SS officers found him in civilian clothes, reportedly drunk, with valuables packed for escape. Hitler, paranoid, disintegrating, furious, ordered him arrested. And then he ordered him shot. On the night of April 28th or 29th, 1945, Hermann Fegelein was executed in the Reich Chancellery Garden. Eva's own brother-in-law, killed on Hitler's direct orders, just 2 days before Hitler and Eva killed themselves. When word reached the Obersalzberg, Gretl was alone, 8 months pregnant, her husband dead by firing squad, her sister, unreachable, in a bunker beneath a city that was being shelled to rubble. The regime that had elevated her family was devouring itself, and the Brauns were caught inside its teeth. The last child of the inner circle. Then came May 5th, 1945. The war was effectively over. Hitler was dead. Eva was dead. Germany's unconditional surrender was days away. And on that day, in the wreckage of the Obersalzberg, the same mountain complex where the Nazi elite had once gathered for alpine holidays and strategic meetings, Gretl Braun gave birth to a daughter. She named the baby Eva Barbara after her dead sister. Think about what this child was born into. Her father had been executed for desertion by the leader of the regime he served. Her aunt had died beside Adolf Hitler in a suicide pact. Her mother was a widow at 29, surrounded by the rubble of a collapsed empire. Some historians call Eva Barbara the last child born to the Nazi ruling faction. She entered the world carrying a name that connected her to the very centre of the Third Reich, and she had no say in any of it. This baby's story will come back later, and when it does, it will break your heart. But first, the family had to survive the immediate aftermath, and that meant facing the people who had come looking for answers. If you're the kind of person who finds these hidden aftermath stories fascinating, subscribe and hit the bell. We cover them every week. The questions they were not prepared for. As American forces and counterintelligence corps teams swept through Berchtesgaden in the spring of 1945, they rounded up anyone connected to Hitler's world. The Brauns were detained and questioned. Gretl, still recovering from childbirth, and their mother Franziska, who had spent the war years in Munich maintaining the appearance of an ordinary middle-class life. But here is where the story inverts again. The Allies were not looking to prosecute the Braun family. They wanted witnesses, people who could illuminate Hitler's private life, confirm details of his final days, and fill in gaps that the dead could no longer explain. The Brauns occupied a strange position in the post-war hierarchy of guilt, connected to the very top of the Nazi regime, yet never having held official positions or appeared in propaganda. Eva herself had been kept hidden from public view throughout the war, known to almost no Germans before 1945. The family understood immediately that minimizing their connection was the key to survival. Both Franziska and Gretl insisted that Eva had never discussed politics, that their visits to the Berghof were purely social occasions, and that they had been kept at a distance from the regime's inner workings. One American intelligence report from June 1945 noted that Franziska's denials seemed rehearsed and absolute, the kind of answers that come from practice, not spontaneity. Denazification tribunals eventually classified both women as Mitläufer, followers, the lowest category of guilt in the post-war system. No serious penalties followed. Their assets connected to Eva's estate were confiscated, but they walked free. The legal system had processed them and moved on. But the moral questions were just beginning, and those would follow the Braun family for the rest of their lives. The eldest sister's secret. Before we follow that thread forward, there is one more family member whose story complicates everything. Ilsa Braun, the eldest of the three sisters, had spent 8 years before the war working as an assistant to a Jewish physician named Martin Levy Marx. When Nazi persecution intensified and Marx was forced to emigrate, Ilsa later claimed that she and Eva had tried to intercede on his behalf, appealing to the connections that Eva's relationship with Hitler provided. Whether this represents genuine resistance or convenient post-war myth-making is impossible to verify. No independent evidence confirms the claim, and Ilsa had every reason to reshape her past after 1945. That ambiguity is exactly the point. The Braun family's story does not deliver simple moral clarity. It never will. Ilsa cycled through 2 wartime marriages, fled the advancing Soviet army from Breslau to the Berghof, and after 1945 spent the rest of her life trying to distance herself from the Nazi years. She settled in Munich, worked in administrative roles, and raised a family under her married name. Friends and neighbours often had no idea of her connection to Eva Braun. When journalists occasionally tracked her down, she declined to comment, politely, firmly, and without exception. She died in Munich in 1979, having successfully built a life entirely separate from her sister's legacy. But she did it by erasing a part of herself that could never be fully erased. A farmhouse at the edge of the world. Eva's parents, Fritz, a schoolteacher, and Franziska, withdrew after the war to an old farmhouse in Ruhpolding, a quiet village in the Bavarian Alps. The financial cushion they had relied on during the war years was gone. Eva had sent money home regularly throughout her time with Hitler, modest sums compared to the fortunes of top Nazi officials, but enough to keep the family comfortable. The denazification process classified all of it as derived from Hitler's gifts and confiscated everything. The fall was steep. Franziska eventually moved to a small apartment in Munich's Schwabing district, barely 40 square meters, with walls scarred from Allied bombing raids and windows replaced with cheaper materials. She shared a bathroom with 3 other families on her floor. Her pension as a teacher's widow covered basic necessities and nothing more. The woman whose daughter had been the companion of Adolf Hitler now lived in a space smaller than most hotel rooms. But the material decline was not the worst of it. What consumed Franziska was something harder to measure and impossible to escape: the psychological weight of being Eva. Hung heavy curtains that stayed drawn even when she was home alone. Hung heavy curtains that stayed drawn even during the day. She installed multiple locks on her apartment door, checking them repeatedly before leaving and again upon returning. When the doorbell rang unexpectedly, she would freeze, standing in silence until whoever was outside gave up and left. Strangers confronted her on the street, demanding to know what she had known, what she had done, whether she felt shame. These encounters grew less frequent over the years, but never fully stopped. As late as 1970, a university student knocked on her door hoping for an interview. She opened it just wide enough to speak a single sentence: "I have nothing to tell you," then closed it again. Fritz died in Ruhpolding on January the 22nd, 1964. Franziska followed on January 13th, 1976, at the age of 96. Together, they had outlived their daughter by nearly 3 decades, but they spent those decades as prisoners of a silence they had chosen and could never break. 2 weddings and a disappearing act. For Gretl Braun, the contrast between her 2 marriages tells the entire story of what the war did to her family. Her first wedding, on June 3, 1944, had been a spectacular Nazi society event. The ceremony took place at the Eagle's Nest and the Berghof, with Adolf Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, and Martin Bormann serving as witnesses. It was followed by a 3-day celebration at the Kehlstein House, overlooking the Alps, attended by the inner circle of the Third Reich. Gretl was 29, her husband was an SS general, and the world, at least the world as the Nazis understood it, was still theirs. Her second wedding was a different kind of ceremony entirely. On February 6, 1954, Gretl married Kurt Berlinghoff, a quiet engineer, in what amounted to a deliberate act of erasure. She became Gretl Berlinghoff and disappeared into provincial Bavaria. Kurt asked no questions about her past and made it clear to friends that the subject was permanently closed. He accepted the woman he married without demanding an accounting of who she had been. And for Gretl, that acceptance was the closest thing to freedom she would ever find. But freedom has limits when the past lives inside you. Gretl's daughter, Eva Barbara, later confided to a school friend that her mother suffered from recurring nightmares, waking in the middle of the night crying for her dead sister. The grief was not public. It did not appear in newspapers or court transcripts. It lived in dark bedrooms in the small hours of the morning, in a voice calling out for someone who had been gone for years. Throughout the 1950s, financial necessity forced Gretl to work as a house cleaner, then a seamstress, and eventually a shop assistant in a department store. Her employers never learned her background. Her co-workers knew her simply as Gretl, a war widow raising a daughter alone. For 8 hours a day, she could be someone other than Eva Braun's sister. That anonymity, carefully constructed and jealously guarded, was the closest thing she had to peace. 22 years of silence, then regret. For over 2 decades, not a single member of the Braun family spoke publicly about Eva. No memoirs, no interviews, no letters to the editor, nothing. While Emmy Goring published an autobiography defending her husband and Gudrun Himmler attended reunions of former SS officers, the Brauns simply vanished from the conversation. They neither defended nor denounced. They chose erasure over engagement. Then, in the 1960s, journalist Nerin Egan managed to break through. Working from Ruhpolding, the surviving Brauns cautiously cooperated, supplying diary fragments, family photographs, and carefully measured interviews. For the first time, the family allowed a sliver of their story to reach the outside world. But when the biography was published, the family reacted with what one account described as indignation and dismay at its tone and framing. They had trusted an outsider with pieces of their past, and the result felt like a betrayal. The door slammed shut permanently. No Braun family member ever cooperated with a journalist again. Years later, a reporter managed to reach Gretl by telephone. When asked if she regretted her sister's choices, Gretl offered a single sentence: "Eva was in love, and love makes us blind." Then she hung up and never spoke to another journalist for the rest of her life. This was the family's central paradox. Silence protected them. It kept them out of the spotlight, out of the courts, out of the debates that consumed other Nazi-connected families. But it also meant that the historical record was written entirely by outsiders. Dozens of books appeared over the decades, claiming to explain who Eva was and what her relationship with Hitler truly meant. The Braun family's refusal to engage meant those narratives developed unchallenged by the people who actually knew her. Their silence was a shield, but it was also a surrender, the last Braun. And now we return to the baby born on the Obersalzberg in the final days of the war. Eva Barbara grew up carrying a name that felt, as she reportedly told a close friend, like wearing a mark that never fades. She took her stepfather's surname and lived as Eva Barbara Berlinghoff, a quiet young woman in post-war Bavaria, trying to build a life on a foundation that was never stable. Her mother told her the truth about her father and her aunt, but also emphasized that she bore no responsibility for their actions. It was the best guidance Gretl could offer, and it was not enough. On April 8, 1971, reportedly devastated by the death of her boyfriend in a car accident, Eva Barbara took her own life. She was 26 years old. With her death, Eva Braun's direct bloodline effectively ended. The baby born into the ruins of the Obersalzberg, the last child of the Nazi inner circle, became the last casualty of a family that believed silence could save them. Her obituary made no mention of her family connections. She was buried quietly, and the world barely noticed. The price of disappearing. The Brauns chose a third path, not the defiant defense of Emmy Goring, who filled her Munich apartment with portraits and memorabilia and insisted her husband had been a great man. Not the dramatic rejection of Bettina Goring, Hermann's great-niece, who reportedly chose sterilization to ensure the bloodline would end with her. The Brauns chose something quieter, total erasure, and by most measures, it worked. By the 21st century, few Germans could name Eva Braun's siblings or describe what happened to them. The family achieved what confrontation never could. They faded from public consciousness, absorbed into the anonymous mass of post-war Bavaria. No memoirs, no monuments, no lawsuits, no headlines. Just silence. But the cost was total. Fritz, dead of ear, stress and heartbreak before the occupation was over. Eva's estate, confiscated down to the last photograph. Ilsa, childless, her life built on a foundation of deliberate forgetting. Gretl, haunted by nightmares she could never escape. Eva Barbara, dead at 26. And Franziska, spending her final decades in a 40-square-metre apartment, asking a parish priest whether one could be forgiven for sins committed by association, for the act of loving someone who had done unforgivable things. The priest had no answer that satisfied her. Neither does history. Thanks for watching History Hangover. If you found this video insightful, check out our other deep dives into the hidden aftermath of the Third Reich and the families who survived it. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss our next upload.